Hello everyone, it's Marc Brettler here. Welcome to the NT Pod, a podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 97, and today we're looking at the Bible with and without Jesus. I've got two special guests on the NT Pod today. One of them is my colleague at Duke, Professor Marc Brettler. Marc is the Bernice and Morton Lerner Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University, and Amy Jill Levine from Vanderbilt University. She's the University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies, and Mary Jane Worthen Professor of Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt Divinity School and Department of Jewish Studies. It was a really enjoyable conversation. I hope that you enjoy listening to it. The occasion is their new book, The Bible With and Without Jesus, which is published by HarperCollins, and the discussion goes on for about 45 minutes. I hope you enjoy it. It's a very warm welcome to the NT Pod to highly esteemed colleagues and friends, Professor Amy Jill Levine, from Vanderbilt University, and my Duke colleague, Professor Marc Brettler. Very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
And
thank you very much. Hello from Jerusalem.
Greetings. And the topic is this wonderful new book that the two of you have co-written, The Bible With and Without Jesus. Now, this is not the first time that you two have written together. How did this project come about? What was the origins of the Bible with and without Jesus?
So Marc and I tend to finish each other's sentences. So I can go and then he'll pick up if I get tired or you get bored. After Marc and I did two editions of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, first in 2011 and then in 2017, we thought we had more to say. And from letters we got, because of the Jewish Annotated, we knew that other people wanted more information. One of the things that we knew we wanted to look at was the extensive reception history of the same materials, because when we got to some of these New Testament quotes that are based on, I'm going to use Christian terminology here, based on Old Testament materials, there was just too much for us to put in the footnotes or in little gray boxes. So we thought, wouldn't it be nice to write a book about the reception history of those major Old Testament quotes in the New Testament to show what they meant in their original context, what else they meant in Second Temple Judaism, and then how Jews over the centuries have looked at them without the Jesus part. Not to say that Christians are right and Jews are wrong, but to say that if you look at a text with a particular set of lenses, you'll see certain things. And if you change your glasses, you're going to see other things.
And so to add to that, let me start with a true confession.
As you would.
Yeah, a true confession to my department chair. I was not all that familiar with the New Testament until I did the first edition of the Jewish Annotated New Testament. And working on that project when I was middle-aged and working on something so new was very, very exciting for me. Learning a new set of literature, a slightly new set of methods, because there's a lot of overlap between Hebrew Bible and New Testament. And I really wanted to do more. And this book was an opportunity to do more, and especially was an opportunity to do more in our own voice, because the Jewish Annotated New Testament was really a co-edited book. Our voice is plenty heavy in that book. We're both very heavy-handed editors. Don't tell too many people. But this was really a chance for us not to edit others and to sneak our voice in there, but to really express what we felt.
What was
I want to say something about that.
Go for it.
So having Marc, writing with Marc is great because Marc really doesn't know the New Testament as well as a New Testament professor would. So stuff that seemed to me entirely obvious was opaque to Marc. And that was really helpful in terms of writing this book, because he could tell me what else readers unfamiliar with the New Testament needed to know. Where your social location is helps you in terms of figuring out what additional information is needed and what you don't see because it's obvious.
So what is the actual work? What are the logistics of this thing? Because I have never tried to do a co-written book. I've co-taught with Marc, in fact, and another colleague, Ellen McClarney, on a similar thing, and even that requires a huge amount of consultation and emails backwards and forwards and meetings and who's doing this and when are we doing that. I can't even begin to imagine what it's like logistically co-writing a book like this. So how do you do it? I mean, what is the actual modus operandi for it?
It was fun. At moments, it was challenging.
Mm-hmm.
It was at least 5 times as much work as writing a single book, in part because of all of the backs and forth between us. But the book is comprised of 10 main chapters, each of them dealing either with a passage from the Hebrew Bible or a theme from the Hebrew Bible. And each of them introduced with a New Testament text or a set of New Testament texts. And each chapter had 3 main sections: a Hebrew Bible or Old Testament section, a New Testament Christian interpretation section, and a Jewish interpretation section. So typically what would happen was I would write the Hebrew Bible section, but I couldn't write the Hebrew Bible section until AJ gave me some sense of what the introduction was going to be. So I at least had to have that blocked out so I would know what I'm gesturing toward. So I would do that. AJ would write the New Testament and the early Christianity chapter. And the Jewish stuff, it's a little complicated because some of it is really contemporaneous with the New Testament period. And she knows some of that material, especially the material in Greek, much better than I do. I know the later rabbinic material better. So that we would often jointly author. So it would really be, I would do the Hebrew Bible, she would do the New Testament, and the Jewish section would frequently be jointly authored, with so many emails back and forth.
I bet.
But something else that goes along with that, and this as a nod to Duke University, where the two of you are. Back when Noah was still on the ark and I was in the graduate program at Duke, Duke, bless its heart, as I've learned to say in the South, initially did not allow me to be a teaching assistant in New Testament in the divinity school because I'm not a Christian. So the word came down from on high, even though she's in the New Testament PhD program, we can't let her teach in the divinity school. So let her go do Old Testament. And I said, but I don't do Old Testament. And the word came down, you do now. So for 2 years, I served as a teaching assistant in the divinity school and in the college in Old Testament courses. And I thought, if I'm going to do this, I need to know the Old Testament better than a couple of undergraduate courses that I had had. So I started taking all the Old Testament courses I could, both in the college and in the divinity school. And then 2 years later, the dean who prevented me from doing this teaching died. It was not my fault. And the new dean then said, oh, yes, of course she can do New Testament. She's qualified. And then my very first job was at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. And I was there for 9 years and I was Bible lady. So I did Old Testament every fall and New Testament every spring. Therefore, I know just enough about the Old Testament to be dangerous. And consequently, when Mark would write stuff, I would write in and say, but what about this?
Right.
Right.
And I would show why you were wrong.
Yeah.
On occasion, however, I at least got a paragraph in under the some scholars suggest.
Nice.
And Mark knows just enough of New Testament to be dangerous. Yeah. And that became very fruitful for the two of us. And sometimes we did have arguments about what a text might have meant originally.
And did the two of you argue ever?
We had disagreed.
Okay.
But the fact is, we actually like each other. Right. And it usually on different continents helps. And Mark's usually several hours ahead of me. He's right now in Jerusalem. I'm in Nashville. When we were writing the book, the bulk of the writing, he was in Jerusalem and I was in Rome, but he was still ahead of me.
Right.
So by the time he fires off something that's a little edgy, he's already calmed down because it's 4 or 5 hours. I haven't had enough coffee to be angry. So it was actually a relatively smooth thing, even when we just...
So going back to the origins of the book, I was fascinated by the choice of passages that you were going to look at. Some of them clearly just suggest themselves. To do Suffering Servant from Isaiah seems to me so ideal in this kind of context, for the very point you point out that Christians simply, in my experience, do not think about this either in its historical context or, for that matter, in its Jewish interpretative context across the centuries. So that was just wonderful, entire sort of clarity-filled exposition. I also thought, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Psalm 22 stuff, I think, would just walk up and introduce itself as something obvious to deal with. But some of the choices I found really fascinating in the sense of they wouldn't necessarily have been my first go-to. Jonah, for example, is not massive in the New Testament or in the Christian tradition. He's there, but he's not as big as the suffering servants say. So how did you go about the selection of passages? Did you have a kind of a long list and then whittle it down, or was it always clear it was going to be these particular sections?
Oh, there were many more. In fact, we just published, was it marktorah.com?
Torah.com.
Torah.com, an article on Psalm 2, which could have gone in there. You are my son today.
Right.
But eventually there's a law of diminishing returns, and the book was already a doorstop.
Yeah.
Part of this was because I had been giving public lectures about how Jews and Christians read scripture differently here in Nashville at the larger of the two Reformed Jewish congregations, who have lots of intermarried folks in their congregation, and there's a lot of interest in Jewish-Christian dialogue. So the idea was to provide a forum where we could say, here's how Christians read a text, here's how Jews read a text, and you're both right, considering with the material you're bringing to this. And one of the books that I chose was Jonah. Why? Because I had actually been talking to a friend of mine who does church history, talking about Jonah carved on Christian sarcophagi. Well, that seems very New Testament-y, and Jews would have no idea about this, and everybody thinks that Jonah's a big fish. And I like Courtney and Bess, where you get to sing "It Ain't Necessarily So." So I thought, let's do a lecture on Jonah. So I had a ready-made outline. So that's how Jonah got in, because it was convenient and because it was fun.
Yes, and
I think there's another reason for Jonah and for some of the selection. About half of the 10 main chapters really are passages from the beginning of Genesis, or passages. Or Psalm 22, or the so-called suffering servant. But that's not the only area where there are disputes. There are disputes around books, what entire books mean. So that's what Jonah illustrated. There are disputes around figures and how important certain figures are in the Hebrew Bible in Judaism and Christianity. Thus, Melchizedek became very, very important. There are disputes about themes. Thus, we have a chapter on blood. There are disputes about terms. Thus, a chapter about Son of Man. So, AJ, I'm fully agreeing with you. But I think that now, at least that I look back and see our choices and see what we did not discuss, I think we also did try very, very hard to get beyond discussing 10 passages, because you really do learn different things from discussions of passages, themes, terms, books, and figures.
Right. Sometimes it's a matter of, if you have a passage, well, what in original context comes before and comes after. And here, Jeremiah chapter 31, that new covenant passage, that's really helpful to know, and how parts of that get deployed variously in the New Testament. There's something else that motivated a few of these chapters, such as the Melchizedek thing, which is comparably a tad obscure unless you're a huge fan of the Epistle to the Hebrews. We were interested in texts that led to, in the reception history, anti-Jewish interpretation. I just wanted to get that out there to say we don't have to read polemically. So we flagged some of those anti-Jewish Christian interpretations. We also flagged some anti-Christian Jewish interpretations, where Melchizedek actually comes to play in both realms, to show, okay, we've been at odds in the past. We've been polemical. How can we read in a more irenic manner? What are the possibilities rather than the polemics?
And since AJ mentioned Jeremiah chapter 31, to go back to your original question, we did have a larger list of passages, and Jeremiah 31 was on that list. And at some point, we realized two things. Number one, we just can't write any more chapters. Number two, this book cannot be published without some discussion of Jeremiah chapter 31, especially Jeremiah 31:31. So if you look at our last chapter, on the conclusion from polemic to possibility, we did our best to sneak some of those passages that did not quite make it into that concluding chapter.
Great. And for those who don't have instant recall, Jeremiah 31 is the new covenant stuff, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's also Rachel weeping for her children.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The slaughter of the innocents.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Which is, one's always thinking about this time of year with Epiphany. What day is it today? So time of recording, we're recording January the 4th. So we shall perhaps release this episode on Epiphany to make it topical. So terminology must have been an absolute nightmare. You've already alluded to the question of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. How did you navigate your way around that? Because there's a very nice introduction to the book, which basically walks the reader carefully through some of these issues. But I know in my own teaching, I am really stuck half the time about how to talk about Jewish scriptures. And there was one occasion where I gave a paper at a conference and was talking all about this John Dominic Crossan's idea of prophecy historicized. And I used the term Hebrew Bible throughout. But every single passage that I was talking about in the paper, a questioner pointed out at the end, was from the Greek Bible. So he said, why are you talking about the Hebrew Bible? He says, everything you're quoting there is from the Septuagint. And ever since that question, I've always had an even bigger crisis then. When I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, sometimes I know full well that Luke, for example, is reading the Septuagint. And one of your chapters in this book deals with the interpretation of Isaiah 7:14, the virgin shall conceive passage, where the question of Hebrew Bible versus Septuagint, Hebrew Bible versus Greek Bible, Hebrew Bible versus Matthew's Gospel becomes highly relevant. So how did you, I'm interested in how you navigated your way around that kind of terminological nightmare. And I want to add to that a compliment saying it just reads so clearly. It's the kind of book where you could have got really tangled in the mess of that. How did you manage to do that?
Well, first of all, thank you for your compliment. We tried hard not to get tangled in messes. And by the way, a huge advantage of a book that's co-authored is, sometimes one of us would become tangled in a mess and the other would would help both of us become disentangled. We worried a lot about terminology. And of course, we wrote the introduction last, and sometimes we had to go back and change our terminology. We tried to be careful when talking about quotes in the Septuagint, quotes in the New Testament, to say that they were from the Septuagint, because they're not from the Hebrew Bible, because they're not. Each of the commonly used terms is problematic. Not all of the Hebrew Bible is in Hebrew Bible. Old Testament has theological baggage with it. First Testament is a slightly absurd neologism. We could go on and on. We're both Jewish, and we explained why we did so. We simply use the term Tanakh, which is what has become the native Jewish term. And it's clearly demarcated. So when we're talking about, sorry, you can't see the scare quotes in an only audio podcast, where we're talking about the Hebrew Bible from a Jewish perspective, we use the word Tanakh. When we're talking about those same books, ordered differently, sometimes with different chapters and different chapter organizations, from a Christian perspective, we use the term Old Testament, and we had no issue with it, because from the Christian perspective, there is an Old Testament, which is different from the Hebrew Bible. And even though in some places, the distinction between the two terms might have become jarring to people, it was a very self-conscious decision that we made.
It's also, and I've been working on this for a couple of decades already. When I was in graduate school at Duke, I was told that the term Old Testament was marginalizing and demeaning because old was something that, you put up off the shelf or you renamed or whatever. And I was 21, so what did I know? But as I began to think about this whole Hebrew Bible thing, and when I got my first job, I would list courses in Hebrew Bible and New Testament. That looked weird. And then some students said, to take Hebrew Bible, do I have to know Hebrew? So I thought, okay, now we've got a problem in advertising. But what really bothered me was that the term Hebrew Bible is a Protestant term. It's a term of Protestant hegemony, because the Old Testaments of the Anglicans and the Catholics and the Orthodox have a bunch of other stuff in there that's in Greek, but it's part of the Old Testament, like the books of the Maccabees. Jews get the holiday, Christians get the book. Okay, I'm all right with it. Which I love, or Susanna, the world's first detective story, or the Ben Sira, all that other Greek stuff. So if you just say Hebrew Bible, you're really talking to, like Lutherans, as opposed to a broader Christian community, which itself has distinct canons.
Yeah,
That's
and
really
I'm even
helpful.
more pedantic. I'm also even more pedantic than AJ. So I can call it the 99.92% Hebrew Bible or something like that. But that's a little awkward because parts of it are in Aramaic, and I have nothing against Aramaic.
No, absolutely right. And I think that's wonderful. And also, one of the things that I often find myself talking to students about is the difficulty that in our culture, new is good. We like new things. We want the latest iPhone and the latest TV and all the latest sort of software and all the rest of it. But in the ancient world, a lot of the time, new is not a good term. I mean, there's this marvelous bit in John's Gospel where Jesus is saying, well, I've got a new commandment for you. But actually, it's not really new, because new is sort of not as good as old, because we actually like old stuff better. And I often find that doesn't translate to moderns very well. So that instead of Old Testament being demeaning, it can actually be a term of, real compliment.
Yes, like me, because now I'm old, and old is fabulous, and I am not.
I'm almost as old as you are, AJ. But what's interesting about what you said, this never quite occurred to me. There's an expression that developed in the last century or so in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world, which is Chadash Asur Min HaTorah, that there is a biblical prohibition against doing things that are new. The whole expression is rather complicated. Chadash, something new, has to do with eating new fruit until the proper time and so forth. But that also is a particular view that what is new is not necessarily so wonderful. And it's, let's be old.
Yes, no, that's great. I think that's wonderful. I find that really refreshing. If I can dial down into what one specific exegetical issue around this Hebrew Greek thing, I loved the chapter on Isaiah 7:14, the virgin shall conceive, young woman shall conceive, and getting this into its historical context, and then looking
Actually, don't forget, Mark, the young woman has conceived.
Right. Sorry, yes, absolutely.
The verb tense is also an issue there. So every word in that verse is an issue there.
Right, absolutely. And so let me again, without wanting to be too sycophantic, compliment you both again, but then ask a question on it. The compliment is...
That's perfectly fine.
Great. Okay, thank you. So the compliment is this. If you read someone like Richard Dawkins talking about Isaiah 7:14, it is... I don't care what one's religious background is, I find it cringeworthily uninformed and irritating, but most importantly of all, polemical, just unpleasantly anti-Christian polemical. So I was really interested to see how you would tackle this chapter, and that you do it completely without polemic. And I think one of the ways that you achieve this is by saying, we will discuss polemic. So you actually remove yourself from being inside of the potential sort of polemical materials by discussing others who have interpreted it in certain ways. And Matthew, I mean, although the chapter isn't really about the evangelist Matthew, I think Matthew actually, in the end, comes across better than he does usually when people are talking about this stuff. So that's the sort of the compliment bit. But I did want to sort of tack on to that a question about what you actually think the author was doing, because this is really mainly a book about reception history, I think it would be fair to say, and therefore, an old-fashioned, here's the word old again, but an old-fashioned New Testament scholar like me, who actually wants to know what the evangelist Matthew was actually thinking, it still goes, yeah, but could Matthew read Hebrew? Did Matthew know that he was kind of playing around with things a little bit? And you actually stop a little short of doing that. And I think it's good that you do, but I would still be interested to press you both on the issue of, has the evangelist Matthew pulled a fast one here by trying to co-opt a bit of Isaiah to say that Jesus was born of a virgin?
I don't think Matthew is doing any more there than Matthew does when Matthew tackles the suffering servant, which for Matthew is not about dying for people's sins, but is about Jesus healing people and therefore bearing their diseases. So Matthew knows post-biblical Jewish material. That's clear.
Right.
Whether Matthew's Jewish or not is another question. It's like you don't have to be Jewish to love locks. You don't have to be Jewish, to know post-biblical Jewish stuff. I don't think Matthew was pulling a fast one. I think Matthew was reading a text like a good first century textual reader who has a particular lens and then goes back and looks at the original text and says, what can I do with this? If you want really creative stuff that's sometimes completely off the wall, go look at Philo. So I think Matthew is reading like a good textual person. And with the quotation from the Greek, behold, a virgin will conceive. I think Matthew wanted that not only because Matthew wanted some sort of incarnational theology, like Jesus didn't get to be Son of God at the baptism. Matthew can backdate it to the conception. But I think Matthew also wanted that God with us, you will call his name Emmanuel. You have to continue past the young woman who's pregnant to the virgin who will conceive and get to the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, where the last verse, chapter 28, verse 20. Yes, I can do chapter and verse off the top of my head.
Nice.
Is I am even to the end of the age. So the Isaiah 7:14 in its context is serving multiple purposes, and I think it's entirely deliberate. So at this point, it doesn't matter whether Matthew knows the Hebrew or the Greek. The Greek does the work for him or her or them that the Hebrew would not do.
Right. No,
let me add a few things to that. First of all, Mark, thank you for your comment on Dawkins. Cringe-worthingly uninformed. Perfect 2 words to describe almost everything that Dawkins says about religion. So I like Matthew. Matthew is my favorite gospel. I think part of why I like Matthew is because it feels so rabbinic. And I certainly understand that in its current form, rabbinic interpretation is later than Matthew, but it's well on the way. And it also feels very Dead Sea Scrolly to me. And this already, Christer Stendahl, who's a bit of a hero for me, showed in his dissertation, which became his first book on the School of St. Matthew. Matthew was very much reading in, I don't want to say the first century vein, but one of the first century ways of reading texts from the Tanakh and understanding them as relevant to his own time period, in the same way that some of the Pesher literature did that for the Moreh HaTzedek, for the teacher of righteousness. So that does not surprise me. And in terms of your general question, I know that there are debates about who Matthew really was, what he really knew, how much Hebrew he knew. But I think it is generally agreed upon that his main Bible was the Septuagint. And once your main Bible is the Septuagint, then there's nothing at all surprising about reading it in a Pesher-like fashion, which sees the text. And here there are 2 things going on in Pesher literature. Number one, that it is actualized in the period of the author. And number 2, with at least some of the literature, it is actualized in reference to a particular individual living at the period of the author. So I think in some ways, for somebody reading the Bible in Greek, or predominantly in Greek, I can't imagine that Matthew had no idea that there were some other people in the next neighborhood who were interpreting it slightly differently. But I don't think he had very wonderful access to that. But reading predominantly in Greek, with a tradition of actualized interpretations about an individual, it's a perfectly rational and almost expected interpretation of those particular verses.
Right. We can't get back to who Matthew was. I wrote my dissertation on Matthew, and I keep having these conversations with Matthew, like, Matthew, do you think that? And Matthew's response is usually, I can see where you get it. It's not a terribly helpful answer. But it's clear that Matthew's target audience is Greek speaking. And we do know from church fathers' citation and manuscript copies that Matthew was the most popular of the 4 Gospels in the 2nd and early 3rd century. So Matthew's got a Gentile Greek-speaking audience that's reading Matthew. regardless of whom Matthew targeted this thing, which I think Matthew targeted to anybody who was a believer or maybe a potential believer but they're Greek speaking. So the Hebrew doesn't do you any good here.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So Mark, you mentioned Christa Stendhal. I only had the pleasure of meeting him once when he came to speak in Oxford when I was a grad student, and found him enormously impressive, having already been someone admiring his scholarship. You told me a wonderful thing that Christa Stendhal would talk about, and that's holy envy, the idea of seeing someone else's tradition and having a kind of holy jealousy about it. And one of the things I wanted to underline, still on this topic of polemic and how it comes across, I think in this book, where you two are discussing the Christian tradition, I think it does adhere very nicely to that Stendhal idea of holy envy, not in a kind of a blanket or sort of flat kind of way, but in with critical distance, carefully historically investigating the materials, but with some kind of holy envy. Is that fair to say? Does this emulate that Stendhal principle?
Well, I think both AJ and I, and she'll obviously speak for herself, were very influenced by Christa Stendhal, the person, and we taught together for several years at Brandeis. After he retired from Harvard, he taught at Brandeis for, I believe, for a few years, and I was there. By the way, as did Ed Sanders after he retired from Duke. Right. And I can still remember the first time I heard him discuss that concept. It's a flashbulb memory of the room I was in. And AJ and I grew up in very different sorts of Jewish backgrounds. I grew up in a quite traditional Jewish background. And I heard this concept from him. And it was really, the real reaction I can't say on a podcast, but it was like, this is an absolutely impossible, ridiculous idea. And over a period of time, I began to understand the idea, appreciate the idea, and incorporate the idea. And if it shows in this book, I'm totally delighted.
Right, yeah. Really does.
My own experience, I got to work with him a couple of times at conferences. And the analogy, somebody asked me, what was he like? This must have been in the 90s. And I said, he's like a fabulous ballroom dancing partner whose job is to make his partner look good. So wonderful. In ballroom dancing, the way it used to be before we had Dancing with the Stars and the men actually knew how to move their hips, when you would do a foxtrot or when you would do a waltz, it's the woman or whoever's in the woman's position. That's where the focus is supposed to be. And the man is supposed to facilitate her getting there. And he was exactly like that because he was so generous.
Right.
So here's the senior scholar who would turn to this baby professor and say, AJ, did not you write a chapter on? I mean, he could not have been nicer. For me, the holy envy concept was, I always had it, but he provided me the vocabulary because I didn't know what to call it. I grew up in a predominantly Portuguese Catholic neighborhood. So I was used to processions of saints through the streets and Easter. And I'd go to mass with my friends, usually on Saturday evening, because, it's shorter. I used to dress up my Barbie doll to practice giving her first communion. So, I had lots of these, Catholic envy stuff. I didn't know what Protestants were till I went to college. And Christa Stendhal gave me the vocabulary for that. I didn't want to be Catholic, but somehow I wanted to live in that world and enjoy it. Like, I don't want to be Italian. I want to be an American. I am an American, but I love being in Italy.
Right.
This was holy envy, and Stendhal gave me the language for it.
Wonderful. Tell me about the cover of the book. It's Marc Chagall's picture of Abraham with the three angels, 1966, and there's a lovely bit in the preface where you explain the image and explain the way that different people would look at it. Was that? Do you feel that image and the potentials for that image summarize what you're trying to do in the book? Is that why you chose the image? I assume you did choose the image. I assume HarperCollins
Well,
didn't say, this is what we want you to put.
Well, they tried. They tried several things with us. So actually, at some point, the book title became The Bible with or Without Jesus.
Right.
We had, you talk about holy envy, we had a holy fit. And we said, the whole point of this book is this and, that we really want. We're not doing an either or, we're doing an and both, or we're really doing three things. So they originally had a cover idea for us, which we both disliked intensely. And then they came back to us and they said, okay, why don't you give it a try? And as this was soon after AJ and I had been to Rome, had presented the Pope with a copy of the Jewish annotated New Testament. And actually, on the way home from that presentation in St. Peter's Square with one of the hosts, I stopped in an icon store because I wanted a good souvenir from the day. And I bought Rublev's The Old Testament Trinity, which is what the Chagall is based on.
Right.
And I have that hanging in my office. It's a slightly odd thing to be hanging in my office as somebody Jewish, but I mean, it's hanging in my office precisely for reasons related to this cover.
Brilliant.
Namely, because at least in this cover, it's people visiting Abraham and Sarah. And in Jewish tradition, it is three malachim, three messengers or angels who are visiting them. In Christian tradition, it's the Trinity who is visiting them. And the figures, and of course, just to make this more complicated, but this really, I think, reflects the complication of the book very well, is Chagall is very Jewish. This painting, the angels have halos, which is very Christian.
Right.
Certainly Chagall is well known for his various paintings of Jesus as well. So he is just sort of walking on both sides of the road in the way that we are. Plus, I have always really wanted a book cover that was red. So I really do love this particular painting. And it just, it just stares at you.
Yeah.
Says, read me. Like,
yes.
Why am I the cover for this book?
Absolutely.
But I think that the book cover, the painting, really is emblematic on various different levels for what the book really is about.
It is. I agree. It's so arresting. It's fantastic. Draws the reader in. Can I ask a kind of related question? Who is the audience for this book? And let me just sort of add a little rider to it. I learned a huge amount when I was reading this book, and I suspect it's not really aimed particularly at sort of professors of New Testament, but I learned a huge amount in reading it. Even in small ways where I learned new things about Christian interpretations of certain verses that I were completely new to me. But as you were writing, I mean, it's one of the hardest things in any kind of writing is conceptualizing your audience. I mean, how did you do that? How did you conceptualize the ideal reader, the targeted reader, the inferred reader? How did you work your way through that one?
Part of that was because we had already done 2 issues of the Jewish annotated New Testament, and we had thought seriously about to whom is this book targeted. So we wanted Jews to be able to read the New Testament and not feel like they were being proselytized. We wanted Christians to be able to appreciate Jewish readings and not feel that they were being condemned for not having the one correct reading, if there was such a thing. We wanted people who were interested in Bible, but did not have an expertise to be able to pick up the material and not go, what is this? Because sometimes the Bible can be a tad difficult to understand. We weren't going to start with Romans.
Right.
On the more practical
Very
level,
wise.
Some of this is introducing Jews to stuff that's in the Jewish Bible that Jews don't know.
Right.
So whereas, as you said, the suffering servant in Isaiah, walks up and knocks on the door and says, exegete me.
Mm-hmm.
Jews don't know from this. I mean, because the suffering servant doesn't show up in our liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
So the most Jews would know is if they had seen a picture of the Christ looking in a sad condition. They go, oh, why does he look so sad? Well, because he's being crucified. Well, but there's more than that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it introduces Jews to parts of our own Bible that we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, it will prevent Christians, and this happens to me all the time, phone calls and emails and whatnot. Dear Professor Levine, if you would only look at the Old Testament as it should be understood, you would know that Jesus shows up on every page. And now I can simply say, have a look at this book to see how Jews might interpret the same material.
Right. Yes.
It's more time efficient for me. I can cite my book rather than have to explain in a 5-paragraph email.
Right. No, absolutely.
AJ likes,
Don't co-opt my text.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, AJ likes speaking about her grandmother as the ideal reader. Your mother loves. Yeah, somebody intelligent who does not have much previous background in this material. So we try to be intelligent. We try to write clearly.
Mm-hmm.
We try not to make too many presuppositions. And we try to offer as much background material as possible. I've also heard from some colleagues who are going to be using this as a supplement, either as a main textbook for a course or a supplementary textbook for a course, because it really can show students in a Hebrew Bible or Old Testament course why there are all sorts of different interpretations. And in terms of making it more intelligible, our editor at Harper's, Mickey Maudlin, I think made a very, very good decision in terms of the book's layout and breaking up each of the chapters into sub-chapters so that it's easier to digest the material.
No, that's really helpful. The sub chapters is fantastic because it makes it so digestible. You just got these 2 or 3 pages sometimes of material. In fact, to be honest, the only thing I hated about the book is the endnotes. And the endnotes, they're not even keyed to page numbers. So you have to do that wretched thing where you put a bookmark in the endnotes. And I know it's probably not your decision. That's the only thing I hated about it was that side of things. But I agree. I could definitely see this being used successfully in the classroom. And I think increasingly, and I know it's the case at Duke and many other places, students who are coming in to do a course in religious studies are almost always coming in with that being their first religious studies course. I mean, let alone knowing anything about, say, the Christian tradition or Jewish traditions. It's their first course even looking at a religious text in any kind of critical or historical way. So I think this would just be so ideal for many intro Bible, intro New Testament, or scripture courses. I think it would be fantastic for that. I suspect there'll be huge take up of the book in those areas.
From your mouth to God's ears.
Right. Now I should.
Amen.
Now we've already run 45 minutes.
Speedily and in our days. Sorry.
So we've already run sort of 45 minutes. So I think it'd be a good, wonderful conversation. So appreciate it. So maybe we should just begin to wrap things up. May I ask you what the next joint project is? Are you going to write together again? Because I would certainly love another AJ and Marc project.
I would like to. I will let Marc speak for himself, but I like writing with Marc. And what I would like to do, although both of us have other things we need to finish first, I would really like to look at specific characters, which other than Jonah, we did not really get to develop in this book. And some of this has been done, but I think we can do it in a different way because we've got that double expertise in Christianity and resources. So we have chapters on Adam and Eve, but it would be nice to do a chapter on Abraham, a chapter on Moses, a chapter on Esther, which is really interesting in terms of history. Maybe something on David, and maybe some of the minor characters, like how the prophets have been understood over time as characters rather than as oracles. Daniel has wonderful reception historical material. So I think if we looked at characters, there'd be great characters of the Old Testament that New Testament people know. That might be fun to do.
Yeah, I think we each have major projects that I think we need to finish over the next few years. But I think then I would love to return to do something together. I think the idea of characters is wonderful to return toward the beginning, which is good biblical style. AJ and I recently put something together for the Torah.com in honor of the 12 days of Christmas on Jewish, Christian, and original meaning of Psalm 2. Maybe we'll do something more extensive on the Psalms, which are so important in both Jewish and Christian traditions. But also we'll keep our ears open. So recently, AJ spearheaded an op-ed that appeared in the Daily Beast against a very highly problematic New York Times opinion piece. So we will keep our ears open, and given the problematic way that the Bible, in its broadest sense, in all of its constituent parts, continues to be interpreted, I'm sure we'll find small things to do together here and there.
Splendid. Well, I really hope you do, because this is a wonderful book, great project. And huge thanks to both of you for guesting on the NT Pod. And I will strongly recommend this book. It's called The Bible With and Without Jesus. It's published by HarperCollins, and it's available in all good bookshops now. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, AJ, for being on the podcast.
Such fun to be with you. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, it was fun, Mark. Take care.
Cheers. Well, thanks very much for listening to this latest episode of the NT Pod, and thanks again to my two wonderful guests, Professors Brettler and Levine. You can find the NT Pod on the internet at podacre.blogspot.com, or just look for it on iTunes or wherever you find your favourite podcasts. You can also find me on Twitter at Goodacre, or we have a Facebook page too. Look us out there. And I hope to be back again soon with some more episodes. And in the meantime, a very happy new year to you all. Thanks again for listening. Bye bye.